The studio lights blazed down on Stage 7 of the El Capitan Entertainment Center as Jimmy Kimmel adjusted his tie, that familiar smirk already forming across his face. Tonight's guest list was supposed to be routine. A pop star promoting her new album, a comedian with a Netflix special, and then her. The booking that had his writing staff practically salivating with anticipation. Karoline Leavitt, the 27-year-old White House press secretary, sat in the green room checking her phone. Unlike most guests who spent these final minutes frantically rehearsing talking points or touching up makeup, she appeared eerily calm. What nobody in that building knew was that Karoline had spent the past 3 days preparing for this moment, not with media training, but with something far more dangerous: constitutional law research. "This is going to be like shooting fish in a barrel," one of Kimmel's writers whispered to another as they watched the monitor feed from the green room. "She's probably never been challenged by anyone who actually knows how to ask real questions." But as the show's opening monologue wrapped up and Kimmel prepared to introduce his political guest, something was about to go very, very wrong with his carefully planned ambush. Jimmy Kimmel had built his late-night empire on a simple formula: bring on political figures he disagreed with, ask them softball questions mixed with obvious traps, and let the audience reaction do the rest. His team had perfected the art of making guests look foolish while maintaining the veneer of legitimate journalism. "Ladies and gentlemen," Kimmel announced to the studio audience, his voice carrying that practiced late-night cadence, "our next guest is the youngest White House press secretary in history. She's here to defend the indefensible and explain the unexplainable. Please welcome Karoline Leavitt." The audience applauded, politely, cautiously. This wasn't a friendly crowd, and everyone knew it. Karoline walked onto the stage wearing a crisp navy blazer and a confident smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She shook Kimmel's hand and settled into the guest chair, crossing her legs and folding her hands in her lap. Everything about her posture suggested someone ready for battle. "Welcome to the show, Karoline," Kimmel began, leaning back in his chair with exaggerated casualness. "I have to say, it's brave of you to come into what some might call enemy territory." "Well, Jimmy," Karoline replied, her voice steady and clear, "I don't consider any place where Americans gather to discuss important issues to be enemy territory. That's kind of the whole point of democracy." A few audience members chuckled, not the response Kimmel had expected. "Fair enough," he said, already pivoting to his first prepared attack. "But let's talk about democracy. Your boss has been pretty vocal about media bias, fake news, that sort of thing. Do you think late-night comedy shows are part of that fake news problem?" It was classic Kimmel. Frame the question to make any substantive answer sound defensive or unreasonable. Karoline smiled. "I think late-night shows serve an important function in our democracy, Jimmy. They help people process complex political information through humor. The question isn't whether you're biased. Everyone's biased. It's whether you're honest about it." "Honest about it?" Kimmel's eyebrows shot up. "Are you saying I'm dishonest?" "I'm saying," Karoline replied calmly, "that when you present political commentary as entertainment, you get to avoid the ethical standards that actual journalists have to follow. It's a pretty clever setup, actually." The studio fell silent for a moment. This wasn't going according to script. Kimmel decided it was time to go for the throat. His research team had prepared what they thought was an unassailable line of attack. Something that would expose this young press secretary as the inexperienced political hack they assumed she was. "Let's talk about the Constitution, Karoline," Kimmel said, pulling out a stack of index cards. "Your administration talks a lot about constitutional rights, but I'm curious. Do you actually understand what the Constitution says? Or do you just repeat talking points?" Karoline's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. "I'd be happy to discuss constitutional law with you, Jimmy. What specific provision would you like to explore?" Kimmel grinned. This was exactly where he wanted her. Well, let's start with the First Amendment. Your boss has repeatedly attacked the press, called us the enemy of the people. How do you square that with freedom of the press? That's an excellent question, Karoline said, uncrossing her legs and leaning slightly forward. The First Amendment protects the press from government interference, not from criticism. In fact, the Supreme Court has consistently held that government officials, including presidents, have the same First Amendment right to criticize the media that the media has to criticize them. She paused, letting that sink in. The landmark case is New York Times v. Sullivan from 1964, where Justice Brennan wrote that debate on public issues should be uninhibited, robust, and wide open. That includes criticism flowing both ways. Kimmel blinked. That wasn't in his notes. Well, sure, he said, trying to recover. But there's a difference between criticism and calling us enemies of the people. Is there? Karoline asked. When you spend 20 minutes every night calling the president a fascist, a dictator, a threat to democracy, are those criticisms, or are you essentially calling him an enemy of the people? The audience murmured, some nervous laughter. This was not the planned trajectory. Kimmel shuffled his cards, looking for safer ground. Okay, let's talk about something else. Immigration. Your administration's policies have been pretty controversial. Which policies specifically? Karoline asked. Border security? Legal immigration reform? Or are we talking about the policies that were actually implemented versus the ones the media reported on? The family separation policy, Kimmel said, thinking he'd found his smoking gun. You mean the policy that was implemented in 2017 and ended in 2018? Karoline replied immediately. Or are you referring to the fact that family separation at the border actually increased under previous administrations, as documented by the Department of Homeland Security's own Inspector General reports? Kimmel's confident smirk was starting to fade. I think most people would agree that separating children from their parents is wrong, regardless of when it happened. I completely agree, Karoline said. Which is why our administration ended the practice and implemented new protocols to keep families together. But I'm curious, Jimmy, did you ever do a segment criticizing the policy when it was implemented under previous administrations? Or did it only become a crisis worth discussing when it became politically convenient? The studio fell dead silent. Even the band members looked uncomfortable. Kimmel was starting to sweat under the studio lights, but he still had one more card to play. His writing team had prepared what they thought was an unanswerable question, something that would expose Karoline as a constitutional amateur. All right, Karoline, he said, trying to regain his composure. Let's get technical. You talk about constitutional law like you know it. So tell me, what's the most important constitutional amendment? It was a trap question. Any answer she gave could be twisted, politicized, or made to seem extreme. Karoline smiled. That's like asking which of your children is your favorite, Jimmy. But if I had to choose, I'd say the Ninth Amendment. The Ninth Amendment? Kimmel looked genuinely surprised. Most people would say the First or the Second. The Ninth Amendment, Karoline continued, states that the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. It's the amendment that says the government can't assume that just because a right isn't specifically listed in the Constitution, the people don't have it. She leaned back in her chair, her confidence growing. It's the amendment that protects privacy rights, family autonomy, personal liberty, all the things that don't fit neatly into the other amendments but are fundamental to human dignity. It's also the amendment that both liberals and conservatives cite when they want to protect rights the other side. Kimmel stared at her. This was not the answer he'd expected from someone he'd assumed was a political lightweight. You know, Karoline continued. It's interesting that you asked about the Constitution, because I actually wrote my senior thesis on constitutional interpretation at St. Anselm College. I focus specifically on how the Ninth Amendment has been used to protect both progressive and conservative values, depending on the era. The audience was completely silent now. You could hear the air conditioning. I also spent 2 years working for a constitutional law firm before entering politics, she added casually. We specialized in First Amendment cases, actually, defending both liberal and conservative clients who felt their free speech rights were being violated. Kimmel's mouth opened slightly. This information wasn't in his briefing materials. What happened next would be replayed on social media for weeks. Karoline Leavitt, the supposed political amateur, was about to turn the tables completely. But since we're talking about constitutional law, Jimmy, she said, her voice taking on a slightly sharper edge, I'm curious about your thoughts on something. You've built your career on political commentary, which is absolutely your First Amendment right. But you also regularly host political figures, ask them policy questions, and present yourself as someone holding them accountable. Kimmel nodded cautiously. That's part of the job. It is, Karoline agreed. But here's where it gets interesting from a constitutional perspective. Traditional journalists have certain ethical obligations: verification of facts, presenting multiple perspectives, distinguishing between news and opinion. But entertainers don't have those same obligations, even when they're discussing serious political issues. She paused, letting the implication hang in the air. So you get to have it both ways, she continued. You get to ask gotcha questions like a journalist, but when the answers don't fit your narrative, you can fall back on, it's just comedy. You get to shape public opinion on serious issues without any of the professional accountability that actual journalists face. The audience was dead silent. Even the producers in the control room had stopped talking. That's a pretty sweet setup, Karoline said with a smile that was anything but friendly. You get all the influence of journalism, with none of the responsibility. Kimmel's face had gone slightly red. I think that's a little unfair, is it? Karoline interrupted. When was the last time you had a Republican politician on this show for a substantive, good-faith discussion? When was the last time you admitted you were wrong about something important? When was the last time you used your platform to bridge divides instead of deepening them? The questions hung in the air like accusations. You see, Jimmy, Karoline continued, her voice still calm but with unmistakable steel beneath it. I actually prepared for this interview. I watched your last 50 episodes. I studied your interview techniques. I looked at how you treat guests you agree with versus guests you disagree with. She leaned forward slightly. Did you know that in your last 50 shows, you've interrupted conservative guests an average of 3.2 times more often than liberal guests? Did you know that your comedy segments about Republican politicians average 40% longer than segments about Democratic politicians? Kimmel looked like a man who'd walked into what he thought was a boxing match and discovered his opponent was carrying a sword. I'm not criticizing your bias, Jimmy, Karoline said. Like I said, everyone's biased. I'm criticizing your dishonesty about it. You present yourself as just a comedian when it's convenient, and as a journalist when that's convenient. But you never take responsibility for the impact your bias has on public discourse. The studio was so quiet, you could hear cameras clicking from the press section. Kimmel was clearly struggling to regain control of the conversation. But Karoline wasn't finished. You asked me about constitutional law, she said. So let me share something else. The founders were deeply concerned about the concentration of power, whether in government, media, or any other institution. That's why they built checks and balances into everything. She gestured toward Kimmel. But what checks and balances exist on your power? You reach millions of people every night. You shape opinions on complex issues. You can make or break political careers with a monologue. But who holds you accountable when you get it wrong? Kimmel opened his mouth to respond. But Karoline held up a hand. Don't say the audience, she said. Your audience self-selects. They already agree with you. That's not accountability. That's an echo chamber. She turned slightly to address the camera directly. The real constitutional issue isn't whether politicians can criticize the media. It's whether the media, including entertainment media, has become so powerful and so unaccountable that it's undermining the democratic process the founders designed. The audience was transfixed. This was not political theater they were watching. It was a genuine constitutional discussion happening in real time on late-night television. You want to talk about threats to democracy? Karoline asked, turning back to Kimmel. How about the fact that most Americans get their political information from sources that have no professional obligation to be accurate, fair, or complete? How about the fact that we've created a media ecosystem where entertainment and journalism are—
Am I?
Karoline shot back. Do you think your coverage of political issues has no impact on how people vote? Do you think your characterization of politicians has no effect on their ability to govern? Do you think the way you frame complex issues has no influence on public policy? She let those questions hang for a moment. Because if you really believe that, Jimmy, then you're not as smart as I thought you were. And if you don't believe that, if you know your show has real political influence, then the question becomes, what responsibility comes with that influence? What happened next would become the most watched clip from late-night television that year. Karoline Leavitt was about to deliver a constitutional argument so precise, so devastating, that it would fundamentally change how people thought about media accountability. You know what's really interesting about the First Amendment, Jimmy? She said, her voice taking on the cadence of someone who'd clearly spent years studying constitutional law. It doesn't just protect speech. It assumes that speech will be answered with more speech. The founders believed that truth would emerge from robust debate between competing ideas. She gestured between herself and Kimmel. But that only works if the debate is actually happening. If one side controls the platform, sets the rules, frames the questions, and gets the last word every single night. That's not debate. That's propaganda. The studio was dead silent. Even the camera operators had stopped moving. The constitutional marketplace of ideas requires something we don't have anymore, Karoline continued. Good faith. Intellectual honesty. The willingness to engage with strong arguments from people you disagree with. She looked directly at Kimmel. When was the last time you had a conservative guest on this show who was smarter than you? When was the last time you interviewed someone who made you question your own assumptions? When was the last time you admitted that maybe, just maybe, the other side had a point? Kimmel's face was flushed now. He looked like a man realizing he'd brought a water gun to a tank fight. Here's the thing about constitutional law that most people don't understand, Karoline said, her voice steady and authoritative. It's not about protecting popular speech. Popular speech doesn't need protection. The First Amendment exists to protect speech that makes people uncomfortable, that challenges prevailing assumptions, that forces society to confront difficult truths. She paused for effect. But our media landscape, including shows like this one, has created a culture where uncomfortable speech is shut down, where challenging assumptions is treated as extremism, where difficult truths are dismissed as conspiracy theories or misinformation. The audience was completely— "You asked me about the Constitution, Jimmy," Karoline said, leaning back in her chair with complete confidence. "So let me ask you something. Do you really believe in the First Amendment?" Because believing in the First Amendment means creating space for voices that challenge you, ideas that make you uncomfortable, arguments that might prove you wrong. She gestured toward the audience. These people deserve better than having their political opinions shaped by someone who won't engage honestly with the other side. They deserve to hear strong arguments from across the political spectrum, not just the weakest straw man versions you can find. Something extraordinary was happening in the studio. You could feel the energy shifting. Audience members who had come expecting to watch a young politician get humiliated were instead witnessing something they'd never seen before: a substantive, high-level constitutional discussion on late-night television. One audience member started clapping, then another. Within seconds, a significant portion of the studio audience was applauding, not for Jimmy Kimmel, but for Karoline Leavitt. Kimmel looked stunned. In 15 years of hosting, he'd never lost an audience to a political guest, but Karoline wasn't finished. "Before we finish," she said, raising her voice slightly to be heard over the applause, "I want to thank you for having me on, Jimmy. Not because this was a friendly interview, it wasn't, but because you gave me the opportunity to demonstrate something important." The applause died down as people leaned forward to hear what she would say next. "You can't humiliate someone who's prepared," she said simply. "You can't expose someone as a fraud who actually knows what they're talking about. And you can't defeat constitutional arguments with comedic timing." She stood up from her chair, extending her hand to Kimmel. "The Constitution isn't a punchline, Jimmy. It's the foundation of everything we claim to believe in as Americans. Maybe it's time we started treating it that way." Kimmel shook her hand mechanically, still looking shell-shocked. As Karoline walked off the stage, the audience erupted in applause again, longer and louder this time. In the control room, producers were frantically trying to figure out what had just happened. The social media team was watching their phones explode with notifications. This wasn't just a good interview, it was a cultural moment. Within an hour of the show ending, clips from the interview were trending on every social media platform. The hashtag Caroline Schools Kimmel became the #1 trend on Twitter. YouTube clips racked up millions of views before midnight. But it wasn't just conservatives celebrating. Legal scholars across the political spectrum were tweeting about the quality of Karoline's constitutional arguments. Journalism professors were assigning the interview to their students as an example of what happens when entertainment journalism meets serious preparation. CNN's legal analyst called it one of the most sophisticated discussions of First Amendment law ever broadcast on network television. The New York Times ran a piece titled, "The Constitutional Education of Late-Night Television." Even comedians were tweeting their respect for Karoline's performance. Jimmy Kimmel, for his part, took 3 days off after the interview. When he returned, his monologue was noticeably less political. He never mentioned Karoline Leavitt by name, but his entire approach to political guests seemed to change overnight. The interview had exposed something that many people suspected, but few had articulated. The emperor had no clothes. The supposed intellectual superiority of late-night hosts over their political guests was largely an illusion, maintained by careful guest selection and favorable editing. But Karoline Leavitt had come prepared for war, armed with constitutional law and backed by genuine expertise. She hadn't just defended herself. She'd put the entire late-night political comedy establishment on trial. And she'd won. In the weeks following the interview, something remarkable happened. Other politicians began studying Karoline's approach. Constitutional law books flew off the shelves. Law schools reported increased interest in First Amendment courses. More importantly, the interview sparked a national conversation about media accountability that transcended partisan politics. Liberal journalists began questioning whether entertainment media was helping or hurting democratic discourse. Conservative politicians started preparing more seriously for hostile interviews. The interview became required viewing in journalism schools, political science courses, and constitutional law seminars. It was a masterclass in preparation, intellectual honesty, and the power of expertise over ideology. Karoline Leavitt had walked into Jimmy Kimmel's studio as a target. She left as a teacher, having delivered a constitutional education to millions of Americans who didn't even know they needed one. The young press secretary had proven something that the founders would have appreciated. In a true marketplace of ideas, the best arguments win, regardless of who has the microphone. If you found this constitutional showdown as fascinating as we did, smash that like button and subscribe for more moments when preparation meets opportunity. What did you think of Karoline's constitutional arguments? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss these incredible political confrontations.